Hello and welcome to, what is this? I believe week 13. The first of three presentations on the Plague of Doves. This is a book we're going to take a little more slowly because it's got a lot going on. And actually, this first week we're going to go pretty light because you have a paper due this week, so there won't be any reading comprehension quiz. So I'm just going to sort of introduce the book and address some issues from the first few chapters, and then you'll continue doing the reading and prepare for the second week of Plague of Doves, which will have a reading comprehension quiz. Before we talk about the novel itself, let's talk a little bit about Louise Erdrich, who is the author of The Plague of Doves. She is one of the great living writers. She is very well respected. She's won a lot of awards. We're going to talk about some of that. She was originally born in 1954, so she would be, what, about 60 years old, 61 years old now. She was born in Little Falls, Minnesota. She is part Native American, or the preferred term that I use more often than not is American Indian. She specifically was born into the Chippewa tribe, the Turtle Mountain Band of the Chippewa. The Chippewa are also known as the Anishinaabe Indians or the Ojibwe Indians. Ojibwe, you'll hear a lot used in the book, and that is sort of how she self-identifies. Overall, though, she is of German, French, and Ojibwe descent, so she is not sort of a full-blooded Native American or American Indian. She also has parents and grandparents from Europe, so she is of a mixed race. As I said, she's one of the great modern writers, sort of along with Toni Morrison, probably the two big living writers that we will have read in this class. She's famous for a lot of novels. She writes novels that are set in the northern plains of the United States, where the Ojibwe tribe and some of the Métis European settlers and descendants have settled over the years. She writes what you might call sort of interlinked novels and stories, so characters from one story or novel might show up in another story or novel. She's probably most famous for Love Medicine, which is her, I guess, probably on her gravestone will be written author of Love Medicine. It's sort of her great book. The Beat Queen, Tracks, The Bingo Palace, Four Souls, The Plague of Doves, and The Roundhouse. These are sort of her most famous works, but she's done a lot more than that. And I mentioned that she is sort of a well-regarded author. She is well-regarded in the sense that this list of prizes is one of the more impressive ones that you'll see for a living American author. She has won a Pushcart Prize. She has won a Guggenheim Fellowship. She's won the O. Henry Award for short fiction. She's won the National Book Award, and she was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize for The Plague of Doves, which you are reading now. So Louise Erdrich is known as an author that writes about certain issues or certain ideas. She sort of revisits it, as many authors do. I mean, Faulkner sort of always wrote about the sort of Gothic South, as did some other writers. Cormac McCarthy is known for writing primarily about the desert Southwest. Steinbeck writes about California. Louise Erdrich, first of all, writes about American Indian culture, generally, but more specifically the Northern Plains rural culture. She writes about small towns and Indian reservations on the Northern Plains. And when I say Northern Plains, I'm really talking sort of northern Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota, western Minnesota into Montana, and I think that would be about it. And actually also north of the border into Canada occasionally. So that sort of broad, flat region of the northern United States and southern Canada. She tends to like writing historical fiction. She likes to write around things that actually happened, but creating new characters and situations that relate to that. And she's very interested in the intersection between cultures. We're going to talk more about that. But she's interested in not just Indians, but German Americans, French Americans, the Métis that we're going to talk about. She's also very interested in how religions can coincide and overlap and interact with each other. Her novels are often full of people who are both native in their beliefs and Catholic, because the German and French influence on the Northern Plains is very Catholic. And as I mentioned, because she is sort of constantly revisiting the same places and building on worlds and characters that she has written before, she's interested in what we call world building. The novels of Louise Erdrich, they don't all take place in sort of the same shared world, but to a large extent they do. So her project is more than just any given novel. It's sort of making it all add up to something even greater. So that's a little bit about Louise Erdrich. Now let's talk a little bit about The Plague of Doves specifically. Probably one of the more uniquely named books you've come across. But if you've read the first section for this week, you probably already understand where the title comes from. The novel is set on a North Dakota Ojibwe reservation and in the town of Pluto, which is sort of butts right up against the reservation. So you've got the town of Pluto, which is not on Indian land, but then you also have the reservation that, if you leave Pluto in the right direction, sort of covers most of the land in front of you. So it very literally centers on the intersection between multiple cultures. It also, as I'm sure you've already discovered in your reading, offers multiple points of view and perspectives. Every chapter is sort of about a different person, often told from the point of view of a different person. So this is not a novel where we're following a character through the book. We'll see characters show up and go away and come back. In some ways, I think you'll find that The Plague of Doves is reminiscent of Winesburg, Ohio, in that there are characters that sort of follow us through, but at any moment we might be going down a different alley to see what another character is up to. I've got this bullet point. It says it's centered on a lynching. I don't know that that's entirely true. By the end of the story, certainly the novel is about more than just the lynching that takes place early in the novel, but certainly that's sort of the linchpin, no pun intended, that sort of holds the story together, because characters of different ethnicities and different families that are related to each other through this incident, or should say connected. They're not necessarily related to each other, but connected to each other through this incident, continue to be characters and families that pop up throughout the book. As I said, it's a book that's interested in the intersection of cultures and religions. The cultures are sort of the white French and German European culture of Pluto, and the Indian culture of the reservation, although at this point in history when the book takes place, those two cultures have intermarried and combined in ways that make it really not just about these two different cultures, but also sort of a third synthesis culture that has come about from them. And of course, Catholicism and native religions interact. It's set over a long span of time. It covers, if you count chapters that sort of flash back to the founding of Pluto, it almost becomes a novel about the town of Pluto, in that the earliest moments are from the 1800s when the surveyors go out to find the land, and it ends, I won't spoil too much since you haven't gotten there yet, but it ends sort of, I would argue, with sort of the town slowly sort of taking its last breaths. So it covers, over 100 years in the novel. And ultimately it's interested in multiple stories, multiple people. This book is very much a tapestry. Again, sort of like Winesburg. Maybe not quite as centered around a character the way Winesburg is around George Willard, but still sort of that same, every chapter offers you a different perspective. So the book starts, you'll notice here the Plague of Doves is in quotation marks instead of italicized, so we're no longer talking about the entire novel, we're actually talking about the chapter of the book entitled The Plague of Doves. And we start right away with the intersection of the Indian and the Catholic cultures interacting during what I call the pigeon incident. The book calls it the Plague of Doves. The doves that are being referred to really are just pigeons, but this is something that would have happened 100 years ago, before the carrier pigeons and other species sort of died out in the United States. It would not be unusual for the sky to sort of darken with the arrival of just flocks and flocks of these birds. It was unusual, but it wasn't unheard of, and that's what's happening when this story begins. So some things to notice as you read about, the doves or the pigeons arriving, and Moosham as a character, and some of the events that happen as a result of that. Some things to keep in mind. On one hand, notice that there is no monolithic rural culture here. And I want you to think about how this relates to the other texts that we have read. So, for example, in Starkfield, in Ethan Frome, everybody's basically a Starkfieldian, right? Maybe some are better off than others, but they're all the same basic culture. And I would say the same is generally true in Winesburg. Winesburgians are a fairly homogeneous lot. And then as we move forward, I know in Bless Me Ultima, there's a little bit more interplay. You have this sort of Hispanic culture and then the white culture, and there's some interaction at school. But the Southwest culture is sort of no, I can't say it's monolithic because you have the Merezes and you have the Lunas. So maybe in some ways, the Plague of Doves has more in common with Bless Me Ultima. Or, for another example, Sula, where you have sort of the black culture and the white culture. And it's a novel about the contact zone between those multiple cultures, not a single culture. Um, so that's just something to keep in mind. How is a rural place that has multiple cultures overlapping and interacting different than a rural place that is very homogenous and very one type of culture? And when you base that on the readings that you have done, I think you come up with some really interesting observations. So keep that in mind as you're reading this book. And we've already sort of talked about how ultimately the Plague of Doves isn't just about two cultures interacting, but it's also about a synthesis of those two cultures. The the Indian culture and the white European culture, they've intermarried, they've overlapped, and they've really created sort of a new culture. We get this great line on page 9 where it says, "We are a tribe," referring to the Indians on the reservation, "of office workers, bank tellers, book readers, and bureaucrats." And I want you to really think about that. We're going to talk briefly in a moment about sort of our ideas of American Indian culture. And I would hazard to guess for most of you, thinking of a tribe of Indians who are office workers, bank tellers, book readers, and bureaucrats might not be your stereotypical expectation. So let's talk a little bit about that. How does this line up with our idea of American Indians? Well, when I teach this class in the classroom, I often ask students to raise their hands and tell me what they think of when I say American Indian or Native American. And largely what you get is sort of outdated ideas about Indians. And you talk about sort of headdresses and the Wild West and bows and arrows and war paint and sort of the concept of the noble savage and all of these things that, if they ever defined American Indians, have long since quit defining American Indians. And then I sort of follow that question up with, well, where did you get to know American Indian culture? And most students say, well, I don't. I say, how many people know an actual blood-proof American Indian? And usually maybe 5% of the class raises its hand. And the reason for that is simple. American Indians, largely over the course of a few hundred years, were largely decimated by European colonists and later their descendants sort of moving slowly west. And because of disease, because of war, because of famine, because of a lot of things, most Native Americans died. And so the Native American population of the United States today, or of reservations within the United States today, is just a very small fraction of what that population would have been, say, 200 years ago. And what that causes to happen is many of us base our understanding of American Indian culture not on observing American Indian culture, but on observing a stylized version or a romantic version of American Indian culture that is sort of fed to us by popular media, movies, TV, even well-meaning documentaries. But the reality is today, there are reservations with Indians on it, and there are also many, many American Indians who have moved to cities and gotten jobs working in offices. And so I would push you to sort of take the Plague of Doves as an opportunity to understand maybe a slightly more current idea of the American Indian. Even though a lot of the story takes place in the past, even in, say, the 1960s or 70s when parts of the book take place, it's still very different than some of those ideas of the Indian that the American popular culture sort of carries along. So, that isn't to say that every idea you have about Indians are wrong. Certainly, most ideas about Indians grow out of some sense of the truth or some sense of historical truth. But this novel, I think, will help you maybe challenge or complicate those expectations. All right, so when we get to the chapter or section titled The Million Names, the focus falls eventually on Musham's stories. Musham is the older Indian, the grandfather. And he spends a lot of time in this section telling about things that happened to him when he was younger. For example, he tells a story about how he met Juness during the Plague of Doves, and how they eventually headed west and had sort of adventures. Um, and on page 19 during this, he says this: the story could have been true. Um, and I hope that when you read that, your sort of William Maxwell "So Long, See You Tomorrow" bell went off, and you said, "Oh, another novel that's interested in how we make sense of our history." Certainly, this is more fictional than William Maxwell, but it's interested in some of the same things. Also, he tells the story of the lynching and how he managed to survive when some of the other Indians didn't. And I think some important questions to ask very early on here. How does the book view, or maybe how does it value, storytelling? Um, Certainly, characters want to know the history of their forebears and ancestors. And in the case of Musham, he tells us these stories, but we don't ever know exactly how true they are. Um, and I think something else to ask is sort of, where have we seen this interest in storytelling before? Um, William Maxwell, So Long, See You Tomorrow, certainly one where he uses storytelling to make sense of this place and his past. And to a large extent, I think that is also what Musham is up to, and what some of the other characters listening to Musham are up to. Um, we've also seen it in Weinsberg. If we proceed from the assumption that George Willard is the person writing the stories, then he wants to tell the story of Weinsberg. He wants to tell the history of this place. Even in Ethan Frome, we have a narrator who wants to tell the story of this grizzled old Ethan person that he met. So there seems to be a sense that storytelling in a variety of forms. I think even Bless Me Ultimate has some very interesting stories that are told. Storytelling as a form informs the rural experience. Again, not that people in the city can't tell stories, but because certainly until maybe especially prior to the previous 50 years, so maybe pre-1950 or so, literacy in rural places was much lower than in urban and suburban places. And so storytelling particularly informs the rural experience because stories were often a way of transmitting information to people who maybe couldn't read. And certainly, if we then also piggyback onto that the idea of the American Indian, the American Indian did not evolve a written literacy the way Europeans did. And this, of course, led mistakenly to Europeans thinking that Indians were less intelligent or simpler, when really they had a robust oral tradition that Europeans maybe didn't have. And so is actually also why Europeans sort of foolishly thought that Africans that they took into slavery were the same way, because Africa had a very strong oral tradition instead of a written tradition, the way that Europe did. So all of this feeds into the idea of storytelling being of great value, not just in this book, but to rural cultures, and to specifically here, American Indian culture. So even when we move into the chapter A Little Nip, it is still sort of continually interested in story versus history. And I think it's worth asking, to what extent are these two concepts different? What does history offer us? Sort of stories that claim to be fact. Abraham Lincoln was born in this year. He was elected in this year. He died in 1865 in April. That's history. That's sort of verifiable fact about the past. Stories, though, about the past aren't always up to the same thing. They're not always up to prove things as much as they are attempting to explain things. Certainly Musham's stories. In fact, as you keep reading, you'll find that some of his stories, he changes them later in the book. And I think it's easy to say, well, I don't like that then. Story, if it's not true, then what's the point? But I hope, if nothing else in this class, maybe you've learned that story, whether true or false, is a way to get to the bottom of a larger truth. Certainly, William Maxwell believed that in writing "So Long, See You Tomorrow." Whether or not Cletus Smith ever did the things that Maxwell writes about him doing aren't important. It's important that Maxwell tells the story of him doing it to try to get to a sort of a deeper human truth. So we have that in this novel. But we also have Erdrich intentionally mixing in true, verifiable history. And you may have noticed this, even if you didn't know exactly what they were talking about, when they talked about having a picture of Louis Riel on the wall, and how it was one of the few pictures on the wall. And you may have gathered from context in the novel a little bit about him. But Louis Riel was a real person. He was a Métis leader. The Métis are sort of the French trappers that came over from Europe, and especially after they intermarried with the natives. So this sort of culture in Canada, north of the American border. He was actually one of the founders of the Manitoba province in Canada. He led rebellions against the Canadian government because he wanted more rights for the Métis people. And eventually he sort of got really strange. He became sort of a self-described mystic, or even a prophet, he claimed. And he was involved in a very important battle in Canada called the Northwest Rebellion of 1885. We don't hear much about it in the United States, but it was one of the defining moments in the history of Canada, because it was when sort of this rebellion, this sort of Métis desire for equality and freedom within Canada was really sort of crushed by the Canadian government. In fact, Riel was executed for treason. But now that you know that that's true, verifiable history, it's worth asking, how does this history, the facts, inform the story that Erdrich is telling? And I think there are a lot of possible answers to that. One is it ties the story to some real stakes in the real world. Sort of like Weinsberg is fiction, but it's very interested in the effects of the Industrial Revolution, which really happened, right? So the real history of the United States often informs these fictional books that we're reading about the rural. And as the reading assigned for week 1 sort of draws to a close, we get the chapter called Holy Track. And this chapter is really the story of the lynching. And it's important to understand what happened here, that there was a white family that was murdered. Every member of the family except a sleeping baby who was crying, when the Indians here, including Holy Track, including Musham, including the ones they were traveling with, came upon the house while they were out traveling. And sort of against their better judgment, they went in because they heard the baby crying and saved the baby, and then left. But later, the white sort of posse, I guess you would call it, the group that decided to go find the people responsible for massacring this family, they find Musham and Holy Track and the Indians out, and they lynch them. They hear them say they didn't do it, but they followed their tracks. They found good Indians to blame for a crime, which tells us some pretty ugly things about the ways these cultures were intersecting and interacting. And they string them up and they kill all of them, except we understand that Musham didn't die. And at this point, we're not completely clear why. That will be revealed as the novel goes on. But it's important that you understand this central event, because this farmhouse with this massacred family, but this young baby that survived by not being found, will have repercussions all the way through this novel up until the very end of the final chapter. So it is important. If you read this chapter and you're like, I don't understand what's happening, I encourage you, go back and read it again. It's important to get the facts here. And believe it or not, that's where we're going to stop this week. Because you do have a paper to write, I didn't figure an hour-long lecture was going to be terribly conducive this week. So get through this reading if you haven't already. Write your paper, and then we'll come back to The Plague of Doves, read the middle section of the novel next week. You'll have a reading comprehension quiz, and then we'll go from there. So thank you all. Hope you enjoyed an informative, if maybe a bit shorter than usual, presentation this week, and I look forward to chatting with you again next week. Thank you.